I have a question for you today. Who is wise and understanding among you? I think that's a good question for us to ask ourselves, especially since at Wesley Biblical Seminary, what we're about is teaching people how to be disciples of Christ and how to teach other people how to be disciples of Christ. Faculty and staff, that's what we do all the time, is make room for this and teach this. And students, what you're doing all the time is leading people in ministry and in churches. And everyone in our community, no matter what kind of leadership we're in, what we're needing to do is bring people to Christ, and we're constantly making decisions and trying to do things that really bring that mission and calling into action. So we need wisdom and understanding to be able to do that, right? So it's a good question for us, and it was a good question for the early church. It's a question that James asked in chapter 3, verse 13. So if you want to turn there with me, that's what we're going to look at today. He says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom." So immediately we see that this wisdom is not just knowledge. It's not something we know that is just a transfer. It's not just a mental thing. It's something that affects the whole of life. And you could even say that the wisdom is the conduct. At the very least, the conduct is the evidence of the wisdom. It's definitely not, it's not something that you can divorce. They're united. The wisdom influences the way that you live. So he's asking, who's wise and understanding among you? And the way he's going to answer this question is divide a contrast between two different kinds of wisdom. So he's going to show us what earthly wisdom looks like and then what heavenly wisdom looks like. So let's look at that contrast a little, starting in verse 14. "But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice." So that's his explanation of the earthly wisdom that we come to. That's our natural wisdom that it's not influenced by God and by heaven. That's just earthbound wisdom. And then in contrast, the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So the difference here between these different kinds of wisdom, it starts in the very starting point of the wisdom. So he starts out with the earthly wisdom saying, if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts. So that is the foundation of that kind of wisdom, is jealousy, selfish ambition. It's what's often glorified in our culture, actually. It's that drive, that gonna believe in myself and go after things, go after my dream. I'm gonna figure out how to do it. It involves potentially strategy and really thinking ahead. And these are things that in some ways are good. You know, that's the thing with this earthly, unspiritual, demonic wisdom. It can't just pull something out from nothing. So it still has to use the intelligence that God gave us. It has to use skills and abilities that he gives us to use for his kingdom. But then it distorts those and turns them in to yourself, where you're the central focus. And so if I'm operating out of that kind of wisdom, I'm going to be always looking for how I can get ahead. And sometimes it's really subtle. Sometimes it's not just how I can get ahead. Sometimes it's how I can do things my way. Even if it's good things. Like all of us here want to follow Christ. We want to do his will. But it's so easy to do his will the way we think it should be done, not necessarily the way he wants it to be done. So that's the one side of it, is starting with that selfish ambition. And the other side starts with humility. In verse 13, he talks about the meekness of wisdom. So this kind of wisdom is starting with, God, what is your will? What do you want? How do you want to do it? Recognizing that we in ourselves don't actually know what the best thing is. And we don't know, we can't just use our own thinking to get there. As an example of, before we go on to looking more at James and how he plays out the example, because after he gives these definitions, then he kind of goes through and shows us what does it look like to have these different kinds of wisdom in our life. I want to look quickly at Matthew, actually, chapter 16, where this is just a good illustration of these different kinds of wisdom. This is Peter's confession of who Christ is. So Jesus asks, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And the disciples reply, "Well, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." And then he goes on with the, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." But this is the heavenly wisdom. Flesh and blood did not reveal that to him. That's revealed by the Father who is in heaven, wisdom that comes from above. That's the recognizing who Jesus is, that he's the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then just a few verses later, verse 21, right after this, "From that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised." And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." So right there you have that contrast between wisdom from above, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God," and wisdom from below, where he's not denying that he's the Christ. He's saying, "This is not what the Christ is, Jesus. You should know this. All of our wisdom tells us that that's not how you do it." So a lot of times that's the way it is for us probably. We're not completely denying it and saying, Peter's not saying, "No, actually, I said you're the Christ. No, I'm the Christ. I'm the one to go and save the world." He's not that far off. Satan's not going to put that much effort into it if he can just do a little bit. So he's still saying you're the Christ, but he's just saying, "No, that's not how the Christ is. I can tell you. Let me spell it out from all my wisdom. The Christ does not suffer and die." And Jesus says, "You're not thinking the things of God. You are thinking earthly wisdom. That's no kind of wisdom. That is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. And it's built off of this selfish ambition and our own ways of thinking of things. So you start, the one side is it just starts with the self. And even when you're trying to do things correctly, it's going to go back to my way of doing it. I want to do the right thing, but I want to do it my way. Whereas what God is calling us to is doing the right thing and also doing it his way, which is why this meekness and humility is so important in looking for wisdom. And then James explains what the kind of wisdom that's going to say, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," is something that we can only get from the Father. And it's pure, it's untainted, it's peaceable, gentle, and open to reason. It's not going to, on the one side, you have this wisdom that leads to boasting and being false to the truth. And if I'm trying to just push through and do it my way, I'm going to end up saying the wrong thing or changing my story or just changing it a little bit so that it makes sense, makes me look better. But wisdom from heaven is open to reason. It's full of mercy and good fruits. It's impartial and it's sincere. You're looking for honesty and truth through all of that when you're living your life by heavenly wisdom. And so then James goes on and talks a little bit about what it looks like to live with earthly wisdom and what it looks like to live with heavenly wisdom. So starting with the earthly wisdom, he says, what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? This is chapter 4. Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and don't have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly, to spend it on your passions. So he's talking about what causes fights and what causes quarrels among you is the very wisdom that is earthly, that's driven by that selfish ambition. It's your own passions within you that cause this kind of disorder and every vile practice, as he says earlier. And then you don't have because you don't ask. All we have to do is ask. And then he says you don't ask. You ask but don't receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. That's again the very subtle way that it's wrong. Our earthly wisdom is wrong. It takes what we should be doing, asking. But then if you're asking towards your own motives, you don't receive. And then he says, you adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with this world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you suppose it's to no purpose that the scripture says, he yearns jealously over the spirit that he has made to dwell in us? It's so easy when we're trying to live life based on natural wisdom, on this earthbound wisdom, to try to be friends with the world. We see the people who are successful. We see the people who seem to be doing a good job, and we're like, I want to do what you're doing. I want to be friends with you. I want to act like you. This makes sense. But then he says, friendship with the world is enmity with God. So we're called to give that up, even though it doesn't make sense, and humbly come to him and ask him, what is your wisdom? And it's mind-blowing. It's not something that you can predict because it's something that comes from above. It's not something that comes from within our little world. And in the midst of all of our chaos and all of our continuing and turning to the world for friendship and making ourselves an enemy of God, he says, verse 6, he gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. That's quoting from Proverbs 3. I'm actually going to flip there and read just a little bit of that for you. Starting in verse 28. Do not say to your neighbor, go and come again. Tomorrow I will give it, when you have it with you. Do not plan evil against your neighbor who dwells trustingly beside you. Do not contend with a man for no reason when he has done you no harm. Do not envy a man of violence, and do not choose any of his ways. For the devious person is an abomination to the Lord, but the upright are in his confidence. The Lord's curse is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the dwelling of the righteous. And then here's what he quotes in James. Toward the scorners he is scornful, but to the humble he gives favor. The wise will inherit honor, but fools get disgrace. And so, in the process of that, again, the emphasis here is on humility. Like, we are naturally going to turn to the things that make sense to us and to try to make friends with the world and to try to get ahead and try to do everything that makes sense when we're following that selfish drive and selfish ambition. But he says to humble ourselves. And the good news is when we humble ourselves, he does give grace. He is so willing to be friends with us. He's so willing to love us. And all we have to do is we come to him because he's already called us to come to him. We respond to his initiative and live into the wisdom that he'll give us. So it says, submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and inserting here, not directly from James, but resist the devil and his wisdom, that earthbound wisdom that is marked by jealousy and selfish ambition. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. So we're called here, again, he kind of bookends this whole little conversation, and then he, of course, goes on to give more wisdom nuggets, as James is wont to do. He comes to the end of what we're looking at today, and it's, again, humility is the mark of this wisdom. In the beginning, he talks about making your conduct follow the meekness of wisdom. And then in the end, he says, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. So that's a big part of living in this kind of wisdom, is starting at that place of humility, looking to the Lord and saying, I don't know what you want, and I don't know how you want it, but I want to do things your way. And since that's something that we're not going to get by ourselves, it's in our earthbound wisdom, we're going to be looking for what's the best move for me, what's something that just makes sense, who do I need to make friends with, who do I need to reach out to so that we make the right connections. And I'm thinking about strategy games that I like to play. You have to make certain calls, you make alliances over here, and then you might break it over here. Don't do that in life, just games. But that's the way we think, naturally, and that's not the way he calls us to think. He calls us to just straight up, honest humility, looking to him. But since that's something that's so foreign to the way we naturally think, we're going to have to ask him. So my challenge for you today is this week, as you are spending time with him, you're in prayer, ask him, God, make me pure. Make me peaceable. Teach me how to be gentle and open to reason. Fill me with mercy and good fruits. And make me impartial and sincere. Teach me how to sow in peace so that I can reap a harvest of righteousness. And the amazing and terrifying thing is that he answers prayer. So when we ask for these things, he'll give us opportunities to practice them. And he will build that in you. So that is just so good. But that's my challenge for you this week, is to assess how can I live in humility and come to him every day asking for those characteristics of what true wisdom is. Ask him for wisdom from above, because he'll be glad to give it.